Welcome to the 28th episode of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes. Donald Chase, poet-warrior who refused million-dollar wounds in World War II in Korea. Donald Chase understood that freedom isn't free. He defended his country in two wars, World War II and the Korean War, and in doing so he received 4 Purple Hearts and 2 Bronze Stars. In both wars, soldiers often wished to receive $1 million wound, a battlefield injury that would send the soldier back home, away from fighting, but not one that was bad enough to kill them or leave them permanently maimed. Chase received at least $2 million wounds, but each time he begged his commanding officers to send him back to the front. As an infantryman, he was fiercely loyal to the men he served with, and he couldn't leave their side as long as they were in danger. After the war, Chase found it easier to share his painful memories in poems. This podcast tells the story of Chase's service in 2 cataclysmic wars. During the 1990s, while serving as a teacher with the Department of Defense dependent schools in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, my family and I visited many of the sites associated with World War II, from the beaches of Normandy, where the D-Day landings took place, to the Ardennes forest, where the Battle of the Bulge was fought, to the death camps of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau. We saw what was at stake in World War II, when not only democracy in the U.S., but throughout the world, hung in the balance. I began to write to World War II veterans to thank them for their service. I sent them pictures of the sites that we visited. I invited them to share their stories with me, and I promised to keep them alive in the classes that I taught. What I never could have anticipated was that veterans shared their stories with their buddies and printed my letters in their reunion newsletters. I was soon corresponding with approximately 140 World War II veterans, 20 of whom received the nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor. I had more material than I could ever use in the classes that I taught. To keep my promise, I wrote Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, and launched this series of podcasts, which are based upon the book. Donald Chase was just 16 years old, listening to the radio with his father on Sunday afternoon, December 7th, 1941, when the program was interrupted with the news that Japan had just bombed Pearl Harbor. Donald's father turned to him and with a shocked voice said, "My God! This means war!" Donald envied the young men in his neighborhood who immediately went into the service. "1 year later, when I turned 17, I tried to get my parents' permission to enlist, but they were adamant that I finish high school first," Chase recalled. So Donald waited until he turned 18, and he registered with his local draft board. He told them that even though he was still a senior in high school, that he was anxious to serve. Accordingly, they classified me as a volunteer, and after completing the necessary paperwork, pre-induction physicals, etc., I was sworn into the Army of the United States on May 20th, 1944, at Fort Devens, Massachusetts. Shortly thereafter, Donald found himself on a troop train with hundreds of other newly enlisted men, headed towards Camp Croft in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Chase remembered being in high spirits, thinking he was in for the adventure of a lifetime. I think it is safe to say that because we were mostly 18 and 19-year-old kids filled with the exuberance of youth, thoughts of being killed were somehow pushed to the back of the mind. As you well know, when you're young, only the old seem to die. Young people live forever. I'm not ashamed to admit that many times during the 2 wars that I was petrified with fright, yet still had the unshakable feeling that I was going to come through it okay. Someone else might get killed, but not me. What I am saying here may seem like a contradiction, but I just never had the feeling that I would be killed. Hurt maybe, but not death. Chase found that he enjoyed most aspects of his basic training, which went on for 17 weeks. He especially liked the long marches through the peach orchards, which were abundant. I wasn't shy about helping myself to fresh, ripe South Carolina peaches, Chase recalled. In addition to physical training, Chase learned how to disassemble, assemble, and use automatic rifles, machine guns, bazookas, light mortars. There is also a great deal of instruction in the use of hand grenades, mines, and anti-tank tactics. After basic training, Chase was assigned as a rifleman to K Company, 354th Infantry Regiment in the 89th Infantry Division, and was sent to Camp Butner. The division was scheduled to leave Camp Butner the night after Christmas. Chase's company commander gave 48-hour passes to all the men who wanted them so that they could try to get home for one last Christmas. With gas rationing in effect, the only means of travel was by bus or train, and almost all were filled to capacity. After taking a bus to Durham, North Carolina with a buddy who was trying to get to New York, Chase found that all the trains were full. We were standing on the station platform watching a train slowly leaving when somebody in the colored section of the train, they were segregated in those days, threw open a window and motioned to us to climb in. Without any hesitation, both of us went in through the open window to get on that train. Needless to say, when the white conductor came through the car checking tickets, he was shocked to see us amidst all the colored people, but he just punched our tickets and he left us alone. Chase managed to get home on Christmas Eve, but he had to leave the next morning at 5 a.m. to catch a train to return to camp. As I walked away from my home, I left a trail of footprints in the snow which had fallen during the night. From that time on, Christmas memories would include footprints in the snow and the unknown black man who had made my Christmas visit possible. Right after Christmas, 1944, the division was sent to Camp Miles Standish, just outside of Boston, where they waited a few days for their orders to depart aboard the Edmund B. Alexander, setting sail on January 10, 1945. After 10 days at sea, the Alexander arrived at Le Havre, France, and the division was transported by open semi-trailer trucks to Camp Lucky Strike. It was bitterly cold, and the 2 small coal-burning stoves each tent was issued, along with 2 helmets full of coal, were not enough to keep a fire burning. Chase found himself wearing every article of clothing he could from his duffel bag. Food was also scarce. Chase's 89th Division was at Camp Lucky Strike for nearly a month. The young replacement GIs were beginning to wonder if the war was going to be over before they ever got in it. Then they learned that the division was being assigned to General Patton's Third Army and would indeed soon enough be in combat. The division was sent by train, the soldiers cramped together in boxcars filled to capacity, to Trier and Luxembourg. Since my division was a part of General Patton's Third Army, everyone went by the rules that he laid down. One of those rules was that neckties had to be worn. A real oddity under the circumstances. Chase's first combat occurred when his company was told to cross the Moselle River during the second week of March 1945. As his platoon prepared to cross, machine gun bullets began spraying the area. Pinned down, it appeared that the machine gun fire was coming from an old, dilapidated barn with half its roof caved in. Chase's squad leader crawled over to him and asked him to try to get a rifle grenade through the hole in the barn roof. Chase was the squad member who carried 2 to 3 of these rocket-shaped grenades, plus an adapter that allowed them to be fired from the rifle. Mustering up my courage, I got on one knee, put the rifle butt to the ground, and angled it towards the barn, and I pulled the trigger. All aiming toward the target was just guesswork when the rifle grenade went through the open roof and exploded inside. No one was more surprised than I was. There was no more machine gun fire. As a private in the ranks, Chase never knew what the plans called for each day other than constant combat. Chase saw one of his most intense fighting while crossing the Rhine River at St. Goar in mid-March 1945. 2 companies took many casualties, but I was one of the lucky ones who came through without a scratch. The Germans held the high ground and could shoot right down into our boats. The water current was very swift, so some fellas drowned when their boats were sunk. A nasty experience for all. Chase's company captured many towns and took many prisoners during this time. In one attack through some woods, I captured a young German soldier who couldn't have been more than 16 years old. I saw what looked like a bunch of old clothes at the base of a tree. As I went by, I poked my rifle into it, and to my complete surprise, up jumped a young German soldier, hands held high to surrender. That all happened so unexpectedly that both of us just stared at each other. To this day, I do not know who was the most frightened, him or me. As Chase's division pushed further into Germany, they came across large numbers of people, once used as slave labor by the Nazis, who were now freed. They had come from all over Europe, and they now clogged the roads as they attempted to return to their own countries. They traveled in small groups, with each cluster of people displaying a homemade flag indicating their nationality. In one sense, they were a sad and pitiful-looking people, yet when we passed each other on the road, they always had a happy smile and a wave for us. It was obvious they knew their recently acquired freedom was due to the sacrifices of the American soldier. Chase learned that one of the regiments in his division had liberated the Nazi concentration camp of Ohrdruf. I never saw it, but I heard that the place was just horrible in every respect. At the Holocaust Center in Washington, they display my division flag along with other division flags of units who liberated Nazi death camps. By the war's end, Chase's division had nearly reached the German cities of Zwickau and Chemnitz, near the Czechoslovakian border. Word came down that there would be no more movement eastward, and to be on the lookout for Russian troops. Although Chase didn't encounter any Russian soldiers, he did see thousands of German soldiers who were eager to surrender to the Americans before the Russians arrived. They came on foot, bicycles, and horse-drawn wagons, and every sort of conveyance possible. A large open field became a POW camp. After VE Day, Chase's division was moved back to Camp Lucky Strike near Le Havre, France. Chase was put to work processing men who were eligible to return for discharge. A point system was used, which meant that those who had been overseas the longest had the highest points and priority to return home. A few months later, Chase was moved to Linz, Austria, where he was put on guard duty in an area which had been a hotbed of Nazi activity. With so many men being discharged, the Army began offering incentives for soldiers to re-enlist for 3 years. Chase decided to do so, and he was given his choice of theater and a branch of service. He joined an engineer detachment at the Nome Army Air Force Base in Nome, Alaska, where he was trained in structural and crash firefighting. Once his 3-year enlistment was up in October 1948, he returned home to Massachusetts and went to work as a carpenter, building houses and racing stock cars on the weekends. When the Korean War broke out, Donald Chase once again responded to the call of duty and re-enlisted in December 1950 in the regular Army once again. Chase was once again assigned to a rifle squad and became a Bar Browning automatic rifle man. A bar is a potent weapon, but it weighs about 20 pounds without a loaded magazine. Add to this a web belt harness worn to carry 6 20-round magazines, and you really had a load. Needless to say, I wasn't too thrilled at being given this job, but I had sense enough to keep my mouth shut. The fighting in Korea was every bit as bitter as World War II, perhaps even more savage. The soldiers he served with were just as brave as those that served in World War II. But something was different. The country as a whole was not mobilized behind them as the U.S. had been in World War II. For Chase, World War II would always remain America's finest hour. Americans at that time were 100% committed to winning the war. Almost the total population was contributing in one way or the other. I don't really know how to put it into words, that terrific sense and feeling of patriotism that prevailed during the war years. For those of us who wore our country's uniform, no matter what the branch of service was, no matter how hazardous the duty, it was our finest hour. You can talk with veterans of World War II today, and if you listen closely, you will pick up the pride that they had in knowing that when their country called, they answered and did their fighting. Fighting in Korea. The war there was different from Europe because when I first arrived, January 1951, it was like old-time cowboys and Indians. Many North Korean soldiers were left behind after the Incheon landing, and they operated as guerrillas. We could not tell who was North Korean or South Korean, friend or foe. It was a very confused situation. Then, of course, there was the terrain and the climate to contend with. Most of the fighting was done in the mountains, which seemed to cover the whole country. It was very difficult for the various units to maintain contact with each other, so sometimes a company or battalion would find itself surrounded by the enemy and had to receive supplies by airdrop. This happened to my company, and it was 3 days before another company could break through to link up with us. Korea's climate all too often seemed to be the enemy as well. The winter was brutally cold, so frozen or frostbitten hands and feet were common. The summer was like being in a blasted furnace, and with all the wet rice paddies, malaria-carrying mosquitoes did their thing. So between the terrain and the climate, Korea was a very tough place to fight a war. All wars are tough in one way or another, but even with all of its destruction, Europe was still a civilized place, where Korea was not. In addition to its tremendous firepower, the platoon had one man in it who carried a flamethrower. Whenever they came across a cave or a suspicious hole, the flamethrower would shoot in a terrific blast of flame. Occasionally, in response to this, there would be a god-awful scream that made it obvious that some poor devil had just been cremated. Other times, if a ridgeline or hill was becoming very difficult to seize, airplanes would fly over and saturate the whole area with napalm. Moving over and through that blackened, still smoldering burned ground was tough, because everywhere in sight were cooked bodies of enemy soldiers. All I could think of at the time was that they looked like over-grilled hot dogs, seared, charred, with body juices oozing out. It was a very nasty sight. Just something that you had to get used to. On March 13th, 1951, Chase's squad was in the lead as the regiment made its way up a winding ridge line. When bullets began firing, everyone dropped to the ground. Pinned down, Chase noticed a rocky ledge a short distance away, and he asked the lieutenant if he could go out there for a better look. From the ledge, Chase had a clear view of the surrounding area. Suddenly, a North Korean soldier stepped out from behind a large rock. Chase turned to get his bar, but the North Korean began firing before Chase could fire. One bullet went through my upper thigh, leaving a hole as big as a baseball. Another hit the rocky ledge I was on and shattered. About 6 pieces went into my lower back. When this happened, it felt as if someone had struck me with a giant club. Because they were so high up in the mountains, getting Chase to a medic station was an arduous task. 4 Korean laborers who were carrying supplies for the company were accompanied by a GI guide to evacuate Chase, who was given a generous dose of morphine. Although they started off mid-morning, Darkness had long since settled in before they finally reached the aid station about 10 or 11 o'clock that night. I had tears in my eyes, partly from pain and partly from happiness, knowing that we had made it. Chase was evacuated to a Swedish Red Cross hospital in Busan. Chase was in the hospital for 6 weeks. Although his thigh wound healed without any real complications, there was not enough skin left in that area to cover the hole left by the bullet. To correct the problem, the doctor had to cut out a chunk of muscle and then use wire stitches to stretch the skin over the hole. This solved the problem. Worried that if he stayed in the hospital any longer, he might be sent to a different unit from his original one, Chase convinced his hesitant doctor to declare him fit for duty, even though his wounds had not completely healed. Chase returned to his company on or about April 19, 1951, and he was immediately struck by how many men he didn't recognize. So many of the fellows he knew had been killed or wounded. But the war went on. By early June 1951, Chase's unit had been in continuous action for a month and was worn down to the point of being little more than ragged, bearded zombies, operating on willpower alone. Most of my squad was either dead, wounded, missing, or hospitalized with malaria and dysentery. Of the 10 or 12 men that I had started with, only 3 were still around. One day, Chase's company was ordered to capture a crest. The battle had already been costly for both sides, and the hill was still littered with dead and wounded enemy soldiers. The slope was covered with heavy brush and fallen trees. Progress was further slowed by enemy fire and grenades being thrown down on them. Suddenly, Chase saw his squad leader stumble and fall down. He went to his aid and saw that he had been shot through the knee. Chase called for a medic, and then he rushed to rejoin the 2 remaining men in his squad. Reaching the top of the hill, bullets were flying in all directions, and the 3 men took cover behind an uprooted tree stump. I was crouched down, wondering what to do next, when something slammed into my neck with terrific force. My mouth flew open, and a sheet of blood poured out. Although the shock of this stunned me momentarily, it did not knock me out. In my mind was the thought of finding a more protected spot, but when I attempted to move, my arms and my legs would not respond. I was temporarily paralyzed. Scared and unable to move, Chase fought to remain conscious, and he refused the morphine shot when a medic arrived. There had been so many casualties that there were no more litters. Chase was carried off the hill on a poncho strewn between 2 hand-held poles. The doctor who examined me knew right away that my neck was broken. When X-rays showed a bullet lodged between the vertebrae, he directed the ward men to place sandbags on each side of my head, preventing any movement. He told me it was a miracle that I was still alive at all. Chase was placed in a head-to-waist cast, and he was evacuated to hospitals, first in Japan, then Hawaii, Texas, and finally Massachusetts, where he was operated on at the Murphy General Hospital, and the bullet was carefully removed from underneath his chin. Gradually, Chase regained the use of his arms and his legs. Despite receiving a $1 million wound that he miraculously recovered from, by September 1952, Chase begged to return to active duty in Korea. By November 1952, he was back in Korea, this time as an assistant squad leader with I Company, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, holding a sector in an area known as the Iron Triangle, located in the Korwan Valley, a low flatland surrounded by enemy-held mountains. Upon returning to Korea, Chase discovered that the war had become a stalemate, more similar to World War I than World War II. Both sides were now fighting from 2 parallel trenches, which ran from coast to coast. Along the trench line were partially underground bunkers, which were heavily reinforced and generally held 2 to 3 men. Directly in front of the trench line was wide apron of barbed wire, and beyond that was no man's land. Soldiers from both sides never moved in no man's land during the daytime. To do so would have been certain death. "This trench line was just like what you had seen in World War I pictures," Chase wrote. Chase's company was in the sector that became known as the Iron Triangle. Two prominent hills were located in no man's land, one called Jackson Heights and controlled by the enemy, the other Outpost Tom, controlled by the Americans. The fighting was mostly conducted at night. The Chinese kept out of sight during the daytime because the Americans had air superiority. The Chinese held the high ground and forced the Americans to remain hidden as well during the daytime, sending mortar shells and artillery fire raining down on them whenever there was any movement. Each side had listening posts, outposts, and patrols roaming around in the no man's land area. Life in the trenches was difficult without any relief from the constant battle. You stayed up all night. You slept most of the day in underground dugouts, which sometimes had rats and snakes to keep you company. Food was mostly cold sea rations. Water was so scarce, so it might be a month or more before you got a shower and clean clothes. Even when they weren't fighting, there was constant work to be done during the nights when soldiers digging the trenches deeper, putting up barbed wire, laying mines and filling sandbags, and trying to improve the dugouts. Chase recalled the long, frightening Korean nights on the battlefield in his poem, Darkness Brought Death. Each time the daylight faded and darkness filled the sky, the waiting would begin for the night to hurry by. Darkness was the time that the enemy chose to strike. Knowing eyes grew dim and weary as they strained to pierce the night. There was little sound or movement, and the weather took its toll. Bodies ached and stiffened from winter's bitter cold. Hours slowly passed. All senses showed fatigue. Endurance had its limits, with sleep the crying need. Suddenly, without warning, flames and thunder rocked the scene. Shells and bullets hit their targets, while the night was rent with screams. Man-made moonbeams lit the sky. Flares added their glow. Shadows twisted and danced like some weird picture show. Clattering machine guns sang their deadly serenade. Shrapnel whined and howled from exploding hand grenades. From frozen snow-filled holes, men would fight to stay alive. Sadly, though some did live to see a sunrise, many others also died. After 5 months on the front line, Chase's company was put in reserve. What a relief it was to get a break for the 24 hours a day threat of death. Being in reserve meant a hot shower, clean clothes, hot food, and sleeping on a cot instead of a tent. Compared to the frontline conditions, that was living in luxury. The company was given refresher training, but even that seemed like a breeze after being on the front line. Morale improved. Soon enough, the company was returned to the front lines, still in the Iron Triangle, but now in another sector. The trenches, bunkers, and barbed wire in their new position were much the same as before. However, in this sector, nicknamed Happy Valley, there were two mountains controlled by the enemy, Star and Charlie, which gave them a distinct advantage. The Americans had two main outposts in the sector, nicknamed Outpost Dick and Outpost Harry, which were reached through connecting trenches. The outpost that my country was responsible for was called Dick, and it was on a ridgeline that led directly up to the enemy-held mountains. Getting to it involved a long, hard climb through a connecting trench. The route to this outpost was difficult to travel in dry weather, and after a rainy spell, the trench became a sea of mud that increased the difficulty. Reaching that outpost after a slippery, muddy climb would leave a person exhausted. I was making the trip on one of the dry days when I came upon a hand severed at the wrist and half a head lying in the trench. There were just these two pieces of a human body, nothing more. Chase served as the leader of his squad. His squad took turns with other squads to man Outpost Dick, usually staying on the outpost for 2 or 3 days before they were relieved. Outpost Dick was frequently the target of intense enemy mortar barrages, which Chase remembered could stretch nerves to the breaking point. Platoons also took turns conducting regular ambush and reconnaissance patrols. After one all-night ambush patrol, Chase's platoon came across a body as they were returning. Because of the darkness, they had to identify it by the feet and legs. Sneakers meant that it was an enemy soldier. Combat boots meant that the body was one of theirs. Feeling combat boots, Chase knew the body had to be brought back with the platoon. To make sure it wasn't booby-trapped, he tied some wire around the legs, and he dragged the body a few feet. Nothing happened, so they rolled it onto a litter and brought it back to the main trenches. Daylight revealed the body to be a Greek soldier from the Greek battalion that had spent time at Outpost Dick. That body was a living mass of maggots, with the eyes gone and the skin of the face rippling where maggots by the millions were eating beneath it. For days afterward, no matter how many times I washed my hands, I could not erase the feeling of that maggot-infested corpse. On June 10th and 11th, 1953, the enemy launched a full-scale attack on Outpost Harry and Chase's company's trench area. For Chase, an assistant platoon sergeant at the time, the night began like any other, and his company was 100% alert. Chase had a habit of walking up and down the trench line to make sure everyone was awake. Suddenly, a heavy barrage of shells began coming in. The heavy bombardment kept knocking out the phone lines from the squad command posts to the platoon command post. Over and over, Chase spliced wires together so everyone could remain in contact. It was a matter of starting where the wire came out of the bunker, letting it slide through my fingers until I found the break. Then start the other bunker, repeat the process. There was always plenty of slack in the commo wire, so it was easy to make a splice once the break was located. Lieutenant Nestor told Chase that he was receiving no response from the guys in the listening post, located 200 to 300 yards forward of the main trench line. Chase joined Lieutenant Nestor and Sergeant Burns and Woods to check on the listening post and to bring the guys in if they were still alive. Chase described the shelling at this time as unbelievable. They found the 4 guys from the listening post still alive, but badly frightened. Chinese soldiers could be seen moving around as the shells lit up the night. The listening post guides were rescued and brought back to the main trenches. The Chinese had launched a major attack against Outpost Harry, which had badly beaten K Company, which held it. Chase's actions, keeping the communication lines open and rescuing the listening post men, helped defend their position and earned him a Bronze Star. Soon after the Outpost Harry battle, Chase was promoted to platoon sergeant. On July 26, 1953, the day before the war ended, the Korean laborers who supplied the troops with water and sea rations brought up a real treat, 6 5-gallon cans of hot coffee. Chase took a can and crawled from foxhole to foxhole, giving each man in his platoon a canteen cup with coffee. Chase made sure every man had been given coffee before he poured a cup for himself. As he did so, a mortar shell hit without warning. It killed one soldier immediately. The side of Chase's head was ripped open, and each of his legs had 2 big chunks of shrapnel in them, high up near his groin. Once again he was evacuated, this time by helicopter skids, to a surgical hospital, the same Swedish Red Cross one that he had been at 2 years ago. Chase found he had difficulty explaining to the Korean nurse there why he had come back to Korea after his last devastating injury. This time Chase was in the hospital till late September and was discharged only to be shipped home. Chase finally arrived home in October 1953. Even though his nerves were shot, he still debated on whether he should re-enlist. Even though his enlistment had another month to go, Chase was discharged a month early. Maybe somewhere along the line, the severity of the wounds I'd had, plus no nerves left, was picked up by someone who decided I was no longer of value to the Army. Chase went to work as a carpenter, and he drove stock cars at local racetracks. He married Carol L. Bader on June 19, 1955, and together they had 3 children. Although he was proud of his service and his country for defending Korea, a free nation, from being taken over by rogue nations like the USSR and China, Chase found that he had difficulty talking about Korea with his own children or anyone else. The Korean War is the forgotten war because it was fought during a time when everyone here in the States continued to go about their business in a regular way. The war caused no inconveniences to the average citizen, and only those who participated in it, plus their loved ones, were truly aware of it. Otherwise, it was only an occasional paragraph in the newspapers or a blip in the evening news on television. Chase kept his memories of warfare at bay until he retired, when they started coming back full force. Talking about war experiences can be very difficult because no one other than the participants can really understand. I fought as an infantryman in both World War II and Korea. I was wounded 4 times, and I have found that it is easier for me to tell about wartime experiences through poetry. Each one that I have written comes from a scene, a thought, or a feeling that is with me all the time. With each poem, there came a certain kind of inner emotional release of these long-held memories and thoughts. Chase's poem Dreams dealt with his post-traumatic stress syndrome, which haunted him the rest of his life, as it did so many other veterans. Dreams. Life is pleasant in sunshine's bright light, but apprehension begins with the coming of the night. You fall asleep, but dreams fill your mind of days of terror once thought left behind, of days on an outpost in no man's land, seeing the pieces of what once was a man. Who he was, no one will ever know, only part of his head and one hand show. The unseen mortar coughs up its shell, followed by a blast that casts a spell. There is nowhere to go, no place to hide, as the screaming shrapnel spreads ever so wide. At last it's quiet, but you still hug the ground, shocked at first by the absence of sound. The heartbeat slows, and you wake to find it's just another dream playing tricks with your mind. These scenes of battles from days long ago are kept buried inside, so no one knows. And although you try with all your might, you can't stop the dreams that come with the night. In his poem, War's Legacy, Donald Chase explained that the war never really ends for veterans. War's Legacy. From boyhood to adulthood, many changes take place, but the scars left by war are never erased. When you answer the call and you become part of the fight, then you learn of war's horror with all of its fright. How the shells crash down with a chilling sound as you crunch in fear in your hole in the ground. How the bullets zing and whistle past while a friend slumps down and breathes his last. The enemy soldier, just another man, doing his duty as best as he can. No glory exists, and the gruesome sights seen haunt you forever, and they become part of your dreams. When at last it's all over and you sail for home, you carry the scars that are yours alone. Scars on the outside are easy to find. Scars on the inside etched deep in your mind. The years pass and memories fade, but thoughts still turn to the friends that you made, to those who survived it and to those cut down, who today rest quietly in their spot in the ground. Like so many veterans of war, Donald Chase couldn't stop thinking about the friends who never made it home. He wrote of them in his poem, Fallen Comrades. No matter what I'm doing or where my steps may roam, I think about my comrades who never came home. Many years have passed, but my memory hasn't dimmed. A picture of those men still clings and lies within. I see their unlined faces, which never did grow old. The shy, timid, withdrawn ones, and also those so bold. I still hear their youthful banter, brightening many dreary days, keeping all their fear inside, each one in different ways. Yet all did their duty, as good soldiers do so well, existing under conditions that oftentimes were sheer hell. I remember all the sharing, both rations and packages from wives. This generousness of spirit always kept so much alive. All of this stays with me, ever turning in my mind, faces drifting past my eyes from another place, another time. So many times I've wondered, why them instead of me? Maybe in some future world I'll be allowed to see. When they sound the last all Our song today, When They Sound the Last All Clear, is sung by Vera Lynn and written by Elton Box, Desmond Cox, and Huey Charles. Vera Lynn was known as the Force's sweetheart in World War II and toured overseas to entertain the troops in Egypt, India, Burma, and elsewhere. When They Sound the Last All Clear was first broadcast in 1941 and was one of her most popular songs. As with many of her songs, it was one of optimism when sweethearts would be reunited at the end of the war and church bells would once again ring out in peacetime. If you liked this podcast of Always Remember, World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, please leave us a review on whatever podcast network you use. The entire series is still available online, so please be sure to check out our previous episodes and be sure to tell your friends. You can find the companion book, Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, on Amazon.com. Also, Donald Chase has published a book of his poetry, Through My Eyes, a collection of poems by a World War II and Korean War combat veteran, which is available also on Amazon. If you'd be interested in having me give one of my free multimedia World War II presentations, contact me at drjohnu64@gmail.com. Available presentations include Liberators of the Holocaust, Medal of Honor recipients, Minorities in World War II, D-Day, America's Longest Day, Day of Infamy, Attack at Pearl Harbor, Pacific Island Hopping, World War II's Deadliest Battles, A World War II Soldier's Daily Life, and Stories from Always Remember, World War II Through Veterans' Eyes. Each book talk features stories and photographs of veterans from my book, along with original World War II photos of the events they described. All talks are free. I'm located in Rockford, Illinois. I do ask for travel expenses if it's beyond a 1-hour radius. This is actually the last podcast of this series, although all the previous episodes will remain active. I'm going to be launching a new podcast series on my other great passion, wildlife ethology, sometime in July 2026. The series will feature profiles of African wildlife and will include personal encounters from my extensive travels in the heart of Africa. For more first-person World War II history, I strongly recommend Fernando Prieto's Point of View World War II podcasts. In partnership with Rutgers Oral History Archives, Prieto adds cinematic dramatization in You Are There storytelling fashion to bring the first-person remembrances of World War II veterans to life in an unforgettable manner. If you enjoyed my series, I think you'll really like Prieto's POV World War II. Please give it a listen. Thank you for remembering our World War II veterans. As long as we speak their names and tell their stories, the brave veterans of World War II will live on. It's the least we can do for the sacrifices they made for the freedom that we treasure today. Thank you for listening.